In a world where stories fade into dust, there is a place where they are kept alive. Here, in these endless halls, voices from centuries past whisper once more, and forgotten worlds open their doors to you. Welcome to Audible Archives, where every word endures and every tale finds its voice.
Ashford never sleeps. It just hides its secrets under layers of smoke and steel. Tonight, one man steps into its shadows, chasing whispers, dodging lies, and risking everything to pull the truth into the light. You're listening to Audible Archives. Subscribe now and follow Drake Vane into the city of smoke and secrets.
City of Smoke and Secrets. The rain fell steadily over Ashford City, a relentless curtain of silver droplets that blurred the sharp edges of the gas lamps lining the cobblestone streets. The clatter of tram wheels echoed faintly beneath the drone of distant machinery from the docks. In the modest two-room flat above the old tea shop, Drake Vane sat alone by the window, a faint curl of steam rising from his chipped porcelain cup. His steel-gray eyes traced the tram lines below, watching the world move without haste, while his fingers absent-mindedly toyed with the small folding knife clipped inside his coat pocket. The city was restless tonight, though it never admitted to it openly. Ashford always had a secret waiting somewhere beneath the grime and shadow. A knock at the door shattered the quiet. Drake rose, buttoning his dark wool overcoat as he moved to open it. Standing there, framed by the dim hallway light, was Chief Inspector Helen Caraway, a stern woman with sharp eyes that missed nothing. Her presence was rarely casual. "Drake," she said, voice low but urgent, "we have a situation. A body's been found in the Underworks. They're calling it an accident, but something's not right." Drake nodded once, already reaching for his oilskin notebook. "Show me." The Underworks was Ashford's underbelly, a labyrinth of forgotten tunnels and rusting machinery, where the city's discarded secrets gathered like dust. Tonight, the air was thick with the smell of oil and damp earth, a scent Drake knew well from his army days and the years spent chasing the city's darkest corners. The scene was grim. A man lay sprawled beneath a tangled heap of fallen scaffolding, his clothes soaked and smeared with grime. At first glance, it looked like a simple industrial accident, a tragic misstep. But the rigid angle of the body, the faint bruising around the neck, and the way the man's eyes stared blankly at the broken pipes above told a different story. Drake crouched beside the corpse, pulling on his leather gloves. "Who found him?" "Tram conductor," Helen said, voice tight. "Claims he heard a scream, but by the time he arrived, it was too late." Drake's gaze swept the narrow passageway, noting the scuffed footprints, the marks on the metal beams, and the faint scent of tobacco. This was no accident. Someone wanted this man dead, and wanted it to look easy. Back in his flat, with the city's distant hum as a backdrop, Drake poured himself a modest measure from the coal-aged whiskey bottle tucked in his desk drawer. He sipped thoughtfully, the warmth spreading through him, steadying his nerves. Ashford didn't often call him back, and never without reason. Drake flicked open his notebook and began jotting down the sparse details. Names, times, witness accounts, each word weighed carefully before being committed to paper. Outside, the rain softened, but the city's heartbeat only grew louder. Somewhere in its twisting alleys and smoke-wreathed corners, a story was waiting to be uncovered, and Drake Vane was the man who would find it. The morning light seeped reluctantly through the grime-streaked window panes of Drake's flat. Outside, the city of Ashford roused itself slowly, trams clanging and vendors shouting from shadowed corners. But inside, the air was thick with the residue of last night's revelations. Drake sat at his battered wooden table, his brass watch catching a sliver of sunlight despite the crack across its glass. He flipped through his notebook, the weatherproof pages filled with terse observations and scrawled questions. The name of the victim echoed in his mind: Leonard Mills, a machinist at the Underworks, barely 35, and no stranger to danger. A sharp rap at the door pulled him back. It was Nora Whitlock, the clockmaker from the quieter district, a woman whose hands crafted timepieces, but whose eyes seemed to measure secrets. She carried with her a small wooden box, carefully wrapped in oilskin. "Detective Vane," she said softly, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation, "I heard about Leonard. I think you'll want to see this." Drake raised an eyebrow but gestured for her to continue. She opened the box, revealing a collection of small, delicate clockwork parts, gears, springs, and a tiny silver key. "Leonard came to me 2 nights ago," Nora explained, "asking about this key. Said it wasn't his, but someone had given it to him. He was worried." Drake's eyes narrowed, the steel gray catching the light like wet cobblestone. "Worried enough to end up dead in the Underworks?" Nora shook her head, a shadow crossing her face. "He said it opened something important, something someone wanted hidden." Drake folded the box carefully. "And you trust this isn't a wild goose chase?" "Leonard wasn't the kind to chase ghosts," she replied. "Whatever this key opens, it's tied to the old factories. The ones the city forgot." Later that afternoon, Drake found himself back among the labyrinthine alleys and rusted machines of the Underworks. The workers' chatter was low, eyes flicking nervously as he passed. A dockhand named Tom, with grease-streaked hands and a cautious smile, sidled up. "You're the army man, right? Heard you're poking about Leonard's death." Drake inclined his head. "That's right. Anything you can tell me?" Tom glanced around, then leaned in. "Leonard wasn't just fixing machines. Heard he was digging into old company records, looking for something that'd shake up the bosses." "And the bosses? What do they say?" "Quiet as always. But the men who work the docks, well, they don't like questions. Not about the past, and not about money that disappeared." Drake jotted down notes, his mind piecing together the whispered threads. A city built on industry, hiding its skeletons beneath layers of soot and silence. Leonard Mills had stumbled onto something, and it had cost him his life. That night, Drake sat again by the window, the flicker of gas lamps casting long shadows across his face. He lit a cigarette, the ember glowing briefly before the first pull of smoke curled upwards. Ashford was calling. And this time, the secrets it whispered were louder than ever. The persistent drizzle had turned to a cold mist by dawn, cloaking Ashford's streets in a gray haze. Drake pulled his ash-colored scarf tighter against the chill as he made his way to the Ashford Public Library, a building long past its prime, but still a fortress of forgotten knowledge. Inside, the musty smell of aging paper mingled with the sharp tang of ink and dust. Drake approached the archives, where old city plans and industrial records were stored in dimly lit vaults. If Leonard Mills was chasing a ghost, Drake intended to follow the trail. As he sifted through brittle ledgers and faded blueprints, a name surfaced repeatedly: Draxon Industries, the shadowy conglomerate that had once dominated Ashford's factories before a series of suspicious accidents shuttered most of its operations. The company's secrets seemed buried beneath piles of corporate ash. "Looking for ghosts, detective?" Drake looked up to find a young librarian, sharp-eyed and quick-witted, holding a steaming cup of tea. "You could say that." She smiled faintly. Draxon Industries left a mess when they disappeared. Rumors of bribes, blackmail, and worse. Some say the city council still owes them favors. Be careful poking around. Drake nodded, appreciating the warning but undeterred. He returned to his notes, tracing the line between Leonard's key, the old factories, and a long-buried scandal. Later that evening, the familiar hum of Ashford's tram lines provided a soundtrack as Drake rode into the dock sprawl. The air was thick with smoke and salt, voices rough with suspicion. At a cramped pub called the Iron Lantern, he met with Sergeant Milo Grant, a stout man with a gruff voice and a weary smile. "Why drag me out here for a machinist's death?" Milo asked, nursing a pint. Drake leaned in, voice low. Because Leonard wasn't just any machinist. He found something. And someone wanted to make sure he never spoke. Milo nodded slowly. "There's talk of a Tuesday night club, an old group of factory workers and city insiders who met in secret. They shared stories, rumors, maybe even plans. Leonard was part of it." "Tuesday night club?" Drake repeated, intrigued. "Sounds like a place where secrets fester." "Exactly," Milo said grimly. "And if the wrong people find out what Leonard knew, there'll be more deaths. You're not just chasing a murder, Vane. You're chasing a ghost from Ashford's darkest past." That night, Drake stood at the edge of the docks, the water reflecting the city's fractured lights. He pulled his coat tighter, eyes scanning the shadows. Ashford wasn't just a city of smoke and steel. It was a city of whispers. And Drake Vane was determined to make those whispers speak. The Tuesday night mist rolled through Ashford's alleys like a living thing, curling around gas lamps and slick cobblestones. Drake Vane stood outside a low brick building tucked between a shuttered warehouse and a row of forgotten shops. The faded sign read simply, "The Hearth." Inside, the air was thick with tobacco smoke and murmurs. The Tuesday night club was not a club in the traditional sense, it was a circle of secrets, a shadowed refuge where whispers became currency and loyalty was measured in silence. Drake scanned the room, noting the faces, weathered dockhands, former factory workers, a few men with sharp eyes and sharper tongues. They regarded him with suspicion, a stranger wearing the uniform of law where law was often unwelcome. An older man with a lined face and a steady gaze approached. "You're the army man, aren't you? Heard you ask questions." Drake nodded. "I'm looking for the truth about Leonard Mills." The man's eyes flickered briefly. "Leonard was one of us. Found something they wanted buried. The Tuesday night club was his last stop." "Then maybe it should be mine too," Drake said quietly. The meeting that followed was a careful dance. Stories were told, not just of Leonard's last days, but of the city's buried skeletons, factories that burned without explanation, men who vanished after speaking out, deals struck in shadows. Drake listened more than he spoke, his patient gaze drawing out truths veiled in half-truths. The club's members spoke of a ledger, a book of names, dates, and payments that could expose those who profited from the city's suffering. "Where is it now?" Drake asked. The room grew colder, the silence heavier. The old man looked away, voice low. "Lost. Or hidden. But the key Leonard carried, it's said to unlock more than doors. It unlocks the past." Later, alone in his flat, Drake laid out the clues, the key, the ledger, the people who feared both. He poured a small measure of coal-aged whiskey, savoring the warmth against the chill of uncertainty. The city's pulse was quickening, and Drake knew the shadows would not wait. Ashford had secrets. And tonight, they were beginning to stir. The street lamps flickered uncertainly as Drake Vane made his way home from the Tuesday night club. The mist clung to the edges of the alleyways like a living veil, swallowing sound and sight. His footsteps echoed softly on the wet cobblestones. A sudden movement caught his eye, a figure slipping from the shadows, blending into the smoke and gloom. Drake's hand instinctively brushed the folding knife clipped inside his coat. "Detective Vane," a voice whispered, low and rough. "You're digging too deep." Drake didn't flinch. "Who's warning me? A friend or a threat?" The figure hesitated, then stepped forward, an older man, face lined with exhaustion and fear. "They don't want that ledger found," the man said. "Not the city council, not the factory owners. People in places you don't want to know about." "Then why tell me?" "Because Leonard was a good man. Because you're the only one left who might make a difference." Before Drake could reply, the man vanished into the mist. Back in his flat, Drake studied the encounter carefully. The message was clear: someone was watching, someone powerful enough to manipulate the city's darkest corners. Yet this stranger's warning suggested a flicker of hope, a thread to pull at the city's tangled web. He lit a cigarette, inhaling slowly, letting the smoke curl upward as he considered his next move. The ledger, the key, the club, all pieces of a puzzle that might finally expose Ashford's hidden sins. But the price would be high. Outside, the city whispered and waited. And Drake Vane was already stepping deeper into its shadows. The early morning fog clung to Ashford like a shroud, muffling sounds and softening edges. Drake arrived at the city archives, an aging stone building where the past was locked away in dusty volumes and fragile papers. He knew what he was looking for, any trace of the ledger Leonard had spoken about. But years of bureaucracy and deliberate obfuscation meant nothing was easy. Minutes stretched into hours as Drake pored over ledgers and council minutes, tracing threads of money, influence, and dark deals. Every name he uncovered, officials, businessmen, factory foremen, added weight to the growing conspiracy. Suddenly, a shadow fell across the room. Detective Vane. Drake looked up to see a woman in her early 40s, sharp-featured with keen eyes, Maggie Hart, an investigative journalist who had made a name exposing corruption in Ashford's industrial sectors. "I hear you're chasing ghosts too," she said, sliding a file across the table. "This might help." Inside were copies of old letters, photographs of secret meetings, and a partial ledger, enough to reveal payments tied to the very men Leonard had feared. Drake studied the documents, feeling a familiar weight settle in his chest, the burden of truth, the cost of pursuit. Memories of his foster father's quiet steadiness and his army years' hard lessons mingled with the present. "We're walking a dangerous line," he said quietly. Maggie nodded. "But if we don't, Ashford loses more than secrets. It loses itself." That evening, as rain pattered against his window, Drake sat with his folding knife on the table, staring at the brass watch his foster father had given him, the cracked glass catching the dim light. The city's darkness wasn't just outside. It was inside too. The streets of Ashford lay quiet beneath a moon obscured by thick clouds, the usual hum of trams and distant factories replaced by an uneasy silence. Drake Vane's footsteps echoed sharply as he returned to his flat, the weight of the partial ledger heavy in his coat pocket. The door creaked open with a familiar groan. Inside, The room was dark, except for a single envelope placed squarely on his desk. No note, no signature. Drake's fingers brushed the seal. The paper was coarse, the edges frayed. He tore it open slowly. Inside was a single photograph, a blurred image of Leonard Mills' body in the Underworks, but with a fresh, hastily scrawled message in red ink beneath it. "Stop digging. Or next time, it's you." A cold wind seemed to sweep through the room. Drake's steel-gray eyes narrowed. The city was no longer just whispering, it was shouting warnings. He pocketed the photograph and pulled out his folding knife, the faint engraving of his military unit's crest catching the dim light. Quietly, he whispered, "I'm not the one who's afraid." The next morning, Chief Inspector Helen Caraway met him at the station, her expression grave. "We received a report," she said, voice low, "that someone's been asking questions about you." Unofficially. Drake folded the photograph into his notebook. "Then it's time I ask my own." Outside, Ashford's shadows deepened. The city was watching. And Drake Vane knew that every step forward would draw him further into its deadly dance. The gray dawn had barely broken over Ashford when Drake Vane found himself at the rusted gates of an old military barracks turned private storage yard, a place where ghosts from his army days sometimes lingered. His fingers brushed the worn folding knife, a silent reminder of discipline and survival. He wasn't here for old comrades, but for answers. Inside, the air smelled of oil and cold metal. At a back corner, leaning against a crate, was Marcus Hale, a former recon specialist turned dock worker, with a sharp gaze that hadn't dulled with time. "Army man," Marcus greeted, nodding once. "Heard you're poking around the docks again. What's the story?" Drake wasted no time. "Leonard Mills. Found dead. Something about a ledger. And someone doesn't want it found." Marcus exhaled, eyes flicking toward the entrance. "That ledger's trouble. The kind that drags men under. But I might know where a copy, or a clue, could be hidden. Down by the old Draxon factory, near the river." Drake nodded. "Then that's where I'm headed." As the fog thickened along the riverbank, Drake moved cautiously through the skeletal remains of the factory, every step stirring decades of dust and silence. He found a rusted locker, forced it open with a practiced hand, and inside, wrapped in oilskin, a battered ledger. The pages were yellowed, edges frayed, but the names and numbers scrawled within painted a damning portrait of corruption. Drake's jaw tightened. The city's past was a poison, seeping into its very bones. Back in his flat, the weight of the ledger in his hands was matched only by the weight in his chest. The shadows of Ashford weren't just outside anymore, they were closing in. Drake's footsteps echoed in the narrow alley behind the Underworks, his coat pulled tight against the biting wind. The ledger's damning pages burned in his coat pocket, every name a thread threatening to unravel the city's fragile peace. A sudden clang echoed, a warning. From the shadows, two figures emerged, broad-shouldered men with faces half hidden beneath caps and coats. No words. Just menace. Drake's hand brushed his folding knife, then slid to the Webley revolver holstered beneath his coat. Calm and precise, he stepped forward. "You don't want to do this," Drake said low, voice steady like steel. "But if you want to fight, you'll get one." The first man lunged, but Drake sidestepped, drawing his revolver in one smooth motion. A sharp crack echoed. The attacker stumbled, clutching his shoulder. The second man hesitated, then disappeared into the fog. Drake didn't chase. Instead, he retrieved the fallen man's coat and found a slip of paper inside, an address scrawled hastily, a meeting place. His jaw tightened. The city was sending him a message, one more step, and the game was no longer safe. Back in the quiet of his flat, Drake cleaned his revolver slowly, the night's adrenaline ebbing into cold calculation. Ashford was a city of shadows. But Drake Vane was no stranger to darkness. The rain hammered down in relentless sheets as Drake Vane made his way through the twisted lanes of Blackstone Wharf. The address from the note burned into his mind. The docks were deserted, shadows deepened by flickering gas lamps struggling against the storm. A warehouse loomed ahead, its silhouette broken by a single dim light spilling from a high window. Drake's instincts, honed by years of reconnaissance, told him this was no ordinary gathering. Inside, voices murmured over maps and ledgers. Men in heavy coats leaned close, their faces grim and hardened. Drake counted at least half a dozen, city councilmen, factory overseers, men who'd long shaped Ashford's fate in smoke and steel. A man with a cruel smile flicked through a ledger. "We dealt with Mills. That should have been the end of it." Another voice hissed, "But the ledger's still out there. And now an army man's digging too close." Drake's grip tightened on the Webley revolver concealed beneath his coat. His heart beat steady, measured. The city's secrets were powerful. But so was he. As footsteps approached behind him, Drake melted back into the shadows, the rain cloaking his retreat. The game was far from over. Drake sat alone in his flat, the battered ledger spread open across his desk. The rain outside softened to a steady patter, but inside, the storm of his thoughts raged on. Among the scrawled names and coded transactions, one stood out, Richard Carraway, brother of Chief Inspector Helen Carraway. The implication was unmistakable, the corruption ran deeper than he had imagined, entangling those he had trusted. A knock at the door startled him. Helen stepped inside, eyes sharp but weary. "We need to talk," she said quietly. Drake looked up, his steel-gray gaze meeting hers. "There's a line we can't cross, Helen. And I think you've already crossed it." She shook her head. "You don't understand. Sometimes to save a city, you have to dirty your hands." He closed the ledger with a slow, deliberate motion. "I came back to Ashford to find truth, not to be part of its lies." Their silence spoke volumes, a fragile truce hanging in the air between duty and betrayal. Drake knew the path ahead would test not just his resolve, but his soul. The rain hammered down in sheets as Drake Vane stood on the rooftop overlooking Ashford's furnace-lit skyline. Below, the city throbbed with smoke and secrets, but tonight, the air held a tense stillness, as if holding its breath. In his hand, the folded ledger burned like a beacon of truth and danger. The names it bore had toppled kings of industry and exposed corruption that had rotted the city's bones for decades. But victory was never clean. At the meeting in the abandoned factory, Drake faced Helen Carraway and a small faction of honest officers. The confrontation was fierce, voices sharp and eyes harder than steel. "You wanted the truth," Helen said, voice shaking with a mix of regret and resolve. "I wanted justice," Drake replied, voice low and steady. Together, they exposed the conspiracy, the Tuesday night club's secrets, the ledger's damning pages, the city officials who had sold Ashford to the highest bidder. But the cost was high. Drake's foster family's legacy, his own scars from years of war and loss, had led him here, to a city that demanded sacrifice. As dawn broke, painting the sky with hues of ash and fire, Drake lit a cigarette, the smoke curling like the memories he carried. Ashford was scarred but alive. And so was he.
The city story isn't finished. Every shadow hides another name, another danger, another choice that could change everything. Drake Vane has only just begun to pull the thread. Like, comment, and subscribe to Audible Archives, and let the next chapter find you.
Another chapter closes, but the archives remain, waiting for the next seeker of stories. Here, no voice is lost, no tale truly ends. This is Audible Archives. Until we meet again, may your mind wander freely and your heart never forget the stories we share.